young people have traditionally been, pushers of progressive movements and change. I want young people and the Youth Forum to be visible, present, and politically relevant. There's not one person that I've ever met that has not been part of some kind of youth structure. If you remember the Draghi report, what it told us is that if we want to have an Erasmus Plus that actually goes beyond the current 15% of young people that it can reach, we need to have a fivefold increase of the budget. There is this tendency sometimes to see young people as disruptors only in a negative way. It's definitely a very difficult time to be an activist in different spaces across the continent. And we're actually, what sometimes worries me the most is the fact that we're seeing this oppression happen even in some member states of the European Union.
Rareș, thanks a lot for being here. You're the president of the European Youth Forum.
Yes.
First of all, can you introduce yourself a bit and tell us what the European Youth Forum is and does?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, first of all. I'm very happy to be with you here today. So the Youth Forum is, we're the voice of young people in Europe. We are the largest platform of youth organizations on the continent, so at the European level. And what we do is that we actually a platform or like an umbrella organization for other organizations. Mm. So we bring together more than 100 national youth councils on one hand, so the national coordinating and representation bodies for young people across different countries in Europe. And then also international youth organizations that usually have presence in different countries, but are present mostly and operate mostly at the European level, and they work on different thematic topics from education to climate to intercultural exchanges and to sport and so on. So really the Youth Forum is the place where all youth organizations that operate at these levels and that represent young people from local, regional, and national levels come together and actually amplify and represent tens and tens of millions of young Europeans. My role is to lead the organization together with the team, with the board, and with our member organizations, of course, and our secretariat. And it's one hell of a journey.
I can imagine that, especially because in the end of the day, youth is a very broad topic, no? So there are so many topics which can fall into that. You mentioned education, but also maybe, cultural activities, economic opportunities. Isn't it sometimes hard to define like a core mission of this representation, or how do you deal with this?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we speak about youth and young people, particularly in policymaking processes, we understand and we work actually with different aspects of what it means to be young, right? So part of our work at the Youth Forum is focused naturally on socioeconomic inclusion of young people. So we're talking about decent housing conditions, we're talking about access to quality employment. We have had a very big campaign, actually a very big piece of work that has been ongoing for decades now to ban unpaid internships all across in the European Union to begin with, and then hopefully broader throughout Europe. And we've made a lot of progress in all those fields. But that's one part of it. And then, of course, we're also talking about democracy and how young people experience democracy today. We, around the European Parliament elections, and not only, we worked a lot with the party political youth organizations, which are also part of the membership of the Youth Forum, and also with the political parties at the European level to make sure that the priorities of young people are part of their manifestos and that they actually listen to young people when shaping their priorities. And there's no one single sort of most important issue for young people across the continent. And that definitely makes it a bit challenging sometimes to, understand and really prioritize what you want to work on as an organization and as a platform. But I think some part of the understanding that we're trying to raise is that young people are not a homogeneous group, right? So it's not that you speak to young people as a group and then you'll understand by speaking to one what all of them want, but rather through youth representation and all through all these youth movements, we managed to put on the agenda of policymakers topics that matter to us and that otherwise just frankly wouldn't reach them because they're so far away from their lived realities and their political realities that they otherwise wouldn't see them. So that's also part of our role,
And you work then a lot, I gather, with political parties. It's part of your work to try to influence policymaking within the parties. But is that your main task, or do you see it more as a work of trying to also reach out to the young people, to bring them in, to hear their voices? Because I guess it's a two-way street, no? You try to get input from young people, you try to give it to the policy sphere.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's actually what sets the Youth Forum and our member organizations apart, the fact that it is the entire organization, the entire system is based on youth representation. So all the young people that are engaged in the European Youth Forum and also in our member organizations, which is actually the base of the entire platform, are democratically elected by other young people from all levels. So it's really a bottom up and a grassroots approach that actually makes us who we are and ensures that we are connected to the realities of young people across the continent. And then indeed we work with political parties. I wouldn't say it's the main focus, but when it comes to elections or to electoral moments, and we know that the kind of agenda and party political priorities that the parties set for themselves in their manifestos and so on, when we know that these come around, we advocate towards them. For example, for the last elections, we had these common priorities with the party political youth organizations, with the youth wings of political parties. We asked for to have more young people on the lists in electoral lists, and actually in electable positions, so they're not at the bottom of the list just for the sake of being there, to have more youth focused priorities, to have more consultations by the parties with young people. But that's just one part of our work. The other component of our work is actually advocacy and working with the European institutions, with the European Union, of course, but also with the Council of Europe, with the United Nations, because as the Youth Forum, we represent young people and organizations from Europe. So naturally, as a regional counterpart, we find different international organizations that we work with. But I think ultimately we do work a lot on advocacy, and then also ensuring that the ecosystem of youth organizations across the continent is healthy, has the resources to function and to thrive. Because at the end of the day, I'm sure also for us here and for almost every person you can ever ask on the street, their lives have been impacted by youth organizations. There's not one person that I've ever met that has not been part of some kind of youth structure when you think about it. And it can be formal or informal, organized or unorganized. We all are, our lives are deeply impacted by them very often, and we tend to not realize until it's clearly pointed out. So that's also part of our role, to make sure this ecosystem is healthy and can thrive, and that more young people can benefit from these opportunities.
Yeah, but indeed, like, you are a young person and you are very motivated, in making an impact. But what I see is that, like, what is commonly a conception is that young people are not interested in politics. So how do you see that? Do you think this is a reality? Is more a misconception? Is it changing?
I think for many people, the idea that young people need to be engaged is always that you need to be engaged at the highest levels, right? Like, you absolutely, to show that you care, you have to go out on the streets, you have to, go to your local member of parliament or something of the sort, and like do active advocacy that is very structured and organized to show that you care. When frankly, the truth is that we've seen in the past decade, and not only a very significant rise in alternative methods of getting engaged in civic engagement. We're talking about, either boycotts, we're talking about online petitions, we're talking about awareness raising that many young people do, maybe sometimes without realizing it, when they share a cause that they care about or that they want other people to get involved in and engaged in, and they stand by a certain cause. All of that is active involvement and is activism. And I would actually say that in some cases it's maybe more and more constant than what older generations used to do, right? And obviously it's also thanks to the fact that we have the privilege of having access to the internet and having those platforms. And then obviously part of it happens in youth organizations and in youth movements, and that is such a fantastic space, such a big space where young people, for the very first time in their lives, oftentimes they elect a representative, they have a discussion about a certain topic, they make decisions, they debate different topics, they develop their critical thinking. It's where I started as well in a students' council. It's where I really understood how the world around me works and how political systems work and so on. So they are invaluable spaces where young people get involved. But it's true, there is no one size fits all when it comes to youth engagement. What I think is very important to understand is that not every young person wants to be a leader. And that's fine. Just like not every citizen or adult wants to be an elected politician or to be prime minister or something. We always try to bring this idea of, okay, we need to, like, all of us, we need to meet young people where they are, right? And just support their engagement, whether it's through voting, online campaigning, protests, because that's what keeps our democracies alive.
And in a way it becomes more difficult, no? Because in a political party, it's clear that you're motivating people to become politically active, but maybe in this kind of youth organization, if I hear well what you're saying, the way of engaging is much broader.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's we've always really and I've always encouraged my friends, my colleagues, if they're interested in politics, party politics, to go for it, because I think it's a very concrete and direct way of getting engaged in politics, where we know that we need more young people, right? So it's also, there's a very strong value to non-party political youth organizations, which really, like, again, have raised many of us, even when we don't always realize it. And then there's also party political youth organizations and political parties, which are, I mean, after all, they are at the base of a democratic system, right? So through both of these, I think there are very meaningful ways to get engaged. They're very different, of course, and they require different types of experience and maybe interests. But I think they're both very valid and very important ways for young people to get engaged.
Yeah, and I also think that the way of doing activism, communication, why changed a lot, no? Now with social media, for example, no? And considering Gaza, for instance, or the most important political issues now, I think many of the political consensus was also going through social media, no? And political leaders are really looking at social media trends, and what young people say on social media, no? So it's also another way of engagement.
It's true. And I think slowly, both politicians and political parties have come to understand the sheer force that the young generation holds. And we've seen at times in different national elections, unfortunately, that extremist parties tend to understand it a bit faster and tend to understand that momentum and that potential there a bit faster, and to proactively reach out more to young people and to try to get them more engaged and to convince them of their messaging and so on. And what really sometimes is a bit frustrating is to see, established political parties or democratic political parties and so on that really don't engage with young people or don't understand how to do it, and then they just it's a shame, because they, on one hand, you lose electorate and you lose potential voters, and on the other hand, you don't manage to capture the realities into your political platforms and working
totally plans. And it's a vicious cycle, no? I mean, if you're not attractive to young people, there are no young people who enter the party, which makes you even less attractive to young people.
Exactly.
But what I wanted to ask you before is, you're now in your mandate for close to 2 years, right?
Yeah.
When you start the mandate, do you set out together with your board, I imagine, some list of priorities, things you want to achieve, or how did this start for you?
Yeah, so it's my journey at the very beginning started almost 10 years ago in the School Students Council. So I'm from Romania, and in my local School Students Council, I ran for elections when I went to high school, and that's kind of where it all started, and my passion for activism started. And I sort of moved toward different levels and positions within the school student activism. And then on the board of the Youth Forum, I got elected 2 years ago for the first time 4 years ago almost, as a board member. And then 2 years ago as president. And what I said at the beginning of my mandate as president is that I want young people and Youth Forum to be visible, present, and politically relevant. Particularly because our elections in Youth Forum happened at the same time, more or less, as the European Parliament elections. So then we knew that with a whole new parliament, a whole new commission, more or less, and with an ever-changing landscape across Europe in general, we need to have the voice of young people, the representative voice of young people, positioned in the center of all political discussions over the next 2 years, 3 years. Now, for example, with the Multiannual Financial Framework as well. So I think in that sense, we've succeeded, and we're happy that, I'm really happy that the momentum, we've kept it up when it comes to having young people on the agenda, when it comes to having a very clear understanding of why policymakers need to work with young people, with youth organizations when making these decisions. And then on the other hand, it's true, a priority I note that we had was to, as I was saying earlier, to support and to protect this the youth sector, basically across Europe. And when I say youth sector, I mean, of course, on one hand, youth organizations at different levels, also, for example, youth workers and all of these components, which are chronically underfunded and sometimes, unfortunately, and we've seen this repeatedly over the past 2 years, in some countries even attacked, particularly youth organizations, whenever they speak up against the government or whenever they try to raise issues that might be uncomfortable for the parties or the politicians in power. So then it's also our role to speak up and to shed light on these cases and to take all the measures at our disposal to make sure that everyone knows about this and knows that it's unacceptable that in 21st century and in 2025, 2026 that we have these kinds of repressions against independent youth civil society. So we came into a very turbulent landscape. It's not any less turbulent now, but over the past 2 years, I'm happy with how we managed to navigate the different crises that came up. Many of them seen, many of them unseen, to make sure that youth organizations across the continent and that young people have these spaces to get engaged in.
Yeah, and do you personally see yourself that the allocation of the budget of the EU for the next multi-annual financial framework is in line with supporting the youth?
I think it's so. Of course, for the MFF, we're talking about many different programs, right? And many different ways in which the funds are used and allocated to. We have had actually an analysis of the current MFF to see which of the programs impact young people directly or have youth relevant components of it. Spoiler, almost all of them do, because they affect the lives of young people. And then also which of them actually speak about young people as a target group for the funding programs, and many of them didn't. So for us, what's important is that for the next MFF, we have this mainstreamed approach towards young people throughout the different programs, because whether you are a young farmer, whether you're a young person that wants to go on learning mobility, whether you are a young person who's not in employment in education or training, all these different programs, they have a component or a funding stream that is interesting and could be useful for you if you're actually mentioned as part of the as one of the beneficiaries. So right now we're in this space where we're looking at the proposals that the Commission put forward last June or July. And one of our big chunks of work right now is Erasmus Plus and the new Erasmus Plus, which, I mean, there were quite a few changes that happened there from, on one hand, a budgetary increase that is nowhere near enough when you factor in inflation, when you factor in the fact that multiple programs were merged. So this Erasmus Plus program and the European Solidarity Corps programs, they were merged into one. And the Commission said, we increased the budget. So now it's really, the budget increase is there and it's significant. But in fact, if you remember the Draghi report, what it told us is that if we want to have an Erasmus Plus that actually goes beyond the current 15% of young people that it can reach, we need to have a 5-fold increase of the budget. Now, naturally, we know that it's a very difficult funding landscape for the EU as a whole, but I think we can all agree on this. The Erasmus Plus is one of the most successful programs of the European Union. It's a fantastic brand. It's delivered amazing results throughout its implementation and history. So if there's one place where we really think the European Union and the member states should put their money for it to be where their mouths are when it comes to supporting the young generation and so on, the first one to begin with is Erasmus Plus, because obviously it also doesn't only support learning mobility. It supports youth organizations. It supports the youth sector, the sports sector, and so on. And all of these spaces that are oftentimes only made up of young people, and they're the ones that are mostly present there.
And also because it's a cultural investment, no? Like in making young generation feel European, no? Like that you really feel that you are part of a same whole, no, with other people, other citizens of the EU. And do you see that this changed with young generation? Are we feeling more European?
Well, I think we have to start from what does it mean to feel European, right, today? And what we're seeing across Europe is that when you have, in many cases or many countries, such a nationalist discourse and we need to protect ourselves first, and then we'll see whatever happens to European integration and solidarity and so on, it's hard as a young person to sort of maybe move away or out of that bubble unless, you've had access to opportunities or you've had the chance to see why it matters that you're part of this bigger community and family. But I don't think we're any less European, if that makes sense, in a sense that young people have traditionally been, pushers of progressive movements and change and so on, and of the fundamental values of inclusion, of tolerance, of this European family and community, and this support and solidarity, which underpin what the European project is all about. And I think, even if we don't explicitly mention it, there is definitely a sense of being or feeling European. But naturally, that doesn't happen alone, right? Or it doesn't happen by itself. It happens through these kinds of programs. It happens through being engaged in different movements and different organizations. It happens based on a discourse of politicians that, they actually not only mention it but foster this understanding that we are all in the same community, in the same European family. But yeah, it's definitely not easy.
Yeah, I can imagine. And because you said that there are so many of the youth organizations that you represent as an umbrella organization, I think you said more than 100, if I'm not mistaken. Is there, between those organizations, is there a strong feeling of common purpose, or does it happen that there are differences in opinion where you then have to decide which way to go?
There are, the one common goal and the one united purpose that we all have is that we work for and with and we represent young people, right? So that is from the different space that we come from, or from the different domains that we come from, or the different countries that we come from, we have this one clear thing in common. And then obviously on the different topics, whether we're talking about taxation, whether we're talking about defense, for example, whether we're talking about different regional conflicts and approaches towards how we engage with institutions and so on, debates naturally occur. And that's actually one of the in the history of the European Youth Forum, because we turn, in our current way of function, we turned 30 this year.
Congrats.
Thanks. Happy birthday.
Yeah.
But it's
it's older than us.
Yes.
Senior.
Exactly. We'll use that on our anniversary. We're older then. But it's actually what has brought us forward throughout all these years, and the Youth Forum and its different formats that existed for more than 50, 60 years now. So it's been at the core of this youth representation movement at the European level, debate, sometimes disagreement, sometimes differences in opinion, because naturally, as an umbrella organization, it's also our role to find the common ground and to mediate the differences in opinion between what is essentially the representation of young people from an entire continent, right? So I would actually be surprised if there wouldn't be differences in opinion, and it's something we foster and we really value. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, we know that we come around the table and we're united by this common purpose, which is to have a better continent, to have better policies, to have better lives for young people across the continent in all of the different ways that we work in and areas that we work in. So I think it's a very unique environment, and it's a very interesting environment to navigate. But at no point would I be able to say, oh, there's been disagreements that we were not able to move forward from, or that we didn't reach consensus on in the end. And that's also part of what makes Europe, right?
Of course, the differences, no?
Yeah.
And is there a particular topic on which it was difficult to reach an agreement?
I think there are, with the changes we're seeing today, and I think with developments that we're seeing today, whether we're talking about, for example, defense, or we're talking about all of these sort of up-and-coming topics, or competitiveness, or all these components of taxation and the way in which taxation is done at the European level.
We like that you mentioned taxation.
Of course. It's a bit of it's a hook.
Do you do it only because you're on this podcast?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Prepared well.
No, but there are topics in which, of course, we can see that they have a different impact and they mean different things to different young people across the continent. So then, of course, finding consensus there can sometimes prove a bit difficult because the lived realities are so fundamentally different in many cases. But there is no one topic on which we were not able to discuss. But of course, and this is something that I can share very openly, that the fact that we're seeing more and more polarization, we're seeing more and more sort of either this or that, and there's no in between discourse all around us, has definitely made it harder sometimes have conversations about difficult topics or to. But this is we're seeing this everywhere, and for us the sort of asset or the benefit that we have is that we can have these conversations and know that we are united by that one purpose, to come out of that room or to come out of the discussion with how is it that we want to make the lives of the young people that we work with and represent, and that the voice of which we are, better. And I think it's a very unifying purpose that has always, no matter how tough the debates, no matter how different the opinions, brought us all together and brought us forward.
Yeah.
And in your daily life, because you said it's a full-time thing, right?
Yes.
So I think it's also important for people to know that being the president of a youth organization, it's a full-time job. in a typical day or let's say a typical week, how much time do you dedicate for different things? You know, maybe organizing events or outreach to media or lobbying politicians. Like, how can we imagine how you structure your time on average?
Well, it's so maybe just to begin with, there's not all youth organizations have, for example, their leadership being full time, and in the youth forum we also did different pilots to see what works and what doesn't. The president wasn't always full time, but what we notice is that it makes a significant difference. Now, in the way in which the youth forum works, we have a full-time secretariat that is based in Brussels that supports the operations of the organization and so on. We have a board, which is my team and my colleagues that are young people from all across the continent who are elected to lead the organization. And then, of course, we have our members that are all across the continent. My role as president, also being based in Brussels, and my week, it never looks the same. Usually it involves quite a bit of traveling to different events and to different member organizations across the continent. And then, I don't know, for example, today it could be, in December, we had this dialogue or the first meeting of the President's Advisory Board with President von der Leyen. And then the week before that, we're very focused on the preparations and the communication with the other members of that advisory board. I work a lot on engaging with our member organizations and being present at different events in Brussels, or from meeting, I don't know, MEPs to commissioners, sending letters to heads of state and whatnot. But at the core of it all is really the idea that everything that I do ultimately serves the purpose of the youth forum and the young people and organizations that we represent. But it can be difficult also personally at times, because over the past 2 years, we've all seen this, and we've all seen this sort of democratic backsliding in different countries. We've seen immense youth-led movements oftentimes come out of difficult democratic moments in different countries. For example, in Serbia, in Turkey, in Georgia, people reach out to us to tell us, hey, look, this person got arrested or will be going through a trial soon just because they address this issue publicly and the government is unhappy. And then, you shift, whether it's a Saturday or a Sunday, whether you're on vacation or not, no matter the time, that there is this landmark or this very big issue that someone is faced with, or like a young person is faced with, or youth organization is faced with, that you need to tackle and support and organize a response around and see how you can shed light on and work with that. And it's difficult. Obviously, we're in a very and I'm very proud and that we're in a privileged position where we can actually do something about it, right? And we actually have the channels and the platforms and the visibility to bring attention and to bring accountability in some of these spaces where young people are oppressed and where young people are they're suppressed. Actually, the movements are suppressed by governments. But it's definitely a very difficult time to be an activist in different spaces across the continent. And we're actually, what sometimes worries me the most is the fact that we're seeing this oppression happen even in some member states of the European Union, and we're seeing this oppression happen maybe silently sometimes. This shrinking of civic spaces, as we call it, we see it happening all around us. Sometimes it's not so visible. It's a bit more silent. It's maybe you have to file another 3 reports to get your funding, or you have to you have to make sure that you send your documents for approval somewhere else before. So there's all these silent difficulties, or all these silent hurdles that affect how youth organization can work and affect how the young people working within it actually can carry out their work, which is oftentimes volunteer. That's also another component of it. And
I think this is also what makes it very difficult now when the shrinking of civil space is silent. Because what I'm also seeing, that indeed you mentioned Serbia, Georgia, which I think are very good examples, but for instance, in Italian news media, but also at a European level, I do not see that many space dedicated to this. Do you have this sharing as well, this idea that there is not that much attention by news media on how the civic space is shrinking?
I think so. It's very hard to sort of get fought for this in the media spotlight when there's so many atrocities happening and there's so many ways in which our continent is politically disturbed at the moment, which are a lot more flashier and a lot more urgent in a way, arguably, or at least immediately, the impact of which is immediately obvious, right? Whereas for shrinking civic spaces, and I think maybe we're seeing a bit of that in the US, it's a very slow process. And oftentimes it doesn't get media attention until we're really past the point of no return, right? When, the right to freedom of expression, the right to peaceful assembly is almost impossible to fulfill through all these little changes and small maybe red tape at times or these small administrative modifications, or sometimes even outright oppression and violent oppression of protest, like we've seen in Serbia and Turkey, for example. We tend to not realize until it's too late, and then once it's too late we tend to sort of say, but what can we do now? I mean, it sucks, we would love to be able to protest freely, but now that we can't,
Do you feel that those parts of your organization which are based in Turkey or, for instance, in Serbia, they have another awareness of this problem?
They have a better understanding on the ground naturally, and it's a very different environment to navigate as opposed to maybe what we're used to at the European level or in EU member states or in other countries that don't have as stringent rules or as stringent monitoring mechanisms for civil society, for independent civil society. And there are threats sometimes. Maybe sometimes they're a bit more subtle, sometimes they're a bit more outright. And the lived reality there is that whenever we tend to forget, or whenever we tend to not pay full attention to how lucky we are and what a privilege it is to actually be able to speak about topics that don't work, or about issues that we find in our day-to-day lives, to address them publicly, to address politicians directly and openly without the fear of oppression. I think we oftentimes forget just how important all of this is, and how privileged we are, and how much we have to fight actually to keep it. But obviously part of our role as well is to support youth organizations and young people and young activists and so on from all of these countries where they need the visibility and they need the support to be able to keep carrying their work forward, and for the authorities in those countries to know that there is attention being put on those on those places, on the tools that they might have for intimidation, all those things, and that we just won't stand for it, because it goes against every single principle of our movement and what it means to be.
Because I think the one of the issues that we take things for granted, no? And in the US, indeed, you said that it was a slow process, but on the other hand, if you think about it, like until 10 years ago, imagining the US situation today, it would have been almost a dystopia, no? So also the speed through which this democratic backsliding can happen is also very worrisome. So what do you make of the US situation and its possible impact on Europe democracy?
Well, I think it's the impact that we saw was, I think it's a twofold. On one hand, it's true, it happened very fast. On the other hand, this whole discourse that is very polarized, that is very hateful, that is very it's us versus them, it always has to be polar opposites, has slowly made its way into the mainstream political discourse there, and we're always seeing a spillover effect on this side of the pond as well. And then I think it's it started off gradually, and the sort of this overtone window shifted a bit more and more and more and more as to what we find acceptable in political discourse. And then at some point larger jumps started, but by that point I think many people were already desensitized and thinking, okay, this is just another thing, like, okay, oh wow, all right. For example, with Greenland, let's say, I think in obviously it caused and it triggered this international outrage, but I think for many individuals it was there is just another crazy thing, or just another very disruptive way of doing foreign policy that comes from that administration, from the Trump administration. So but the lesson that we have to learn from there, I think, is that once this process starts of polarization, of demonizing the other, of avoiding democratic dialogue and so on, I think that the shift and the change can happen very, very quickly, and you can go downhill very fast from there.
And do you see this as well, you said that you see this happening also in the European discourse. And are you worried of the speed of this polarization also in the European politics?
Yes. The reason behind it is that we were mentioning what it means to be European earlier and what this European identity means. And I think it is enshrined in a set of values that are very clear to understand, are very easy to understand, they're very straightforward. Maybe they're not as well known throughout the continent, and that's always an issue that we have to think about. To which extent do the topics that we talk about here and at the European level actually, affect and make an impact in the lives of European citizens? But I think that when it comes to politics at the European level, the amount of flat out polarization sometimes and just fundamental disagreements has increased. And what we've seen a decrease in is, I don't know, for example, the avenues for the participation and the support of independent civil society, which compounds over time. What we've seen is also a lack maybe of political accountability at times, right? Apart from the elections period. So I think I am afraid of the rate of polarization and the way in which it's developing and it's growing. But ultimately, it really also comes down to us as individual citizens and as young people to, first of all, hold politicians to account, to be mindful and careful about how we interact with others who might hold different opinions from ours. And then ultimately to remember that no matter the difference that we might have and so on, there is a way to find a middle ground, and it's only through dialogue, and it's only through not attempting to demonize the other. Obviously, there are some fundamental differences that in some cases, for some people, it's impossible to get over. And I think even acknowledging that it is a start or is a step forward. But when we see lack of dialogue in politics, I think that's when we need to get a bit worried, because then it's just us against them and it's us against them, and that's it's a cycle that continually perpetuates itself.
And I think we lost indeed the art of compromise, no? Because from my view is that we tend to see more and more things as either black or either white, and we lost a bit the capacity of analyzing our realities complex, no? And also this, of course, can have a huge impact in the political debate.
It's true. What we've seen oftentimes is that indeed compromise tends to favor those who are already in a privileged position. Oftentimes, because obviously then you're in a position of power to negotiate and to lead that compromise to a space where it benefits maybe oftentimes the status quo a bit more, or more, period. So for us, we always try to challenge the idea of compromise just for the sake of compromise, but compromise rather as a result of democratic dialogue, of these kinds of conversations, but keeping in mind the fact that ultimately, for example, for us at the Youth Forum, the goal is for young people tomorrow and in a month and in a year and in 5 years and in 10 years to be better off than they are today, whether it's about their employment situation, whether it's about their housing situation, whether it's about access to democratic participation processes. I am a fan of compromise, but again, in a way that really just values and make sure that those most vulnerable are not the ones being affected in a negative way.
And probably also to say that one thing is to ask, is dialogue happening and is compromise happening? But the other question to ask is, at which level is the dialogue happening? Is it only a national dialogue, or is it a European dialogue? And that's a bit also the background behind why we do what we do with the podcast, that we try to bring topics at the European level. And I think it's also our personal wish to communicate why it's important to have these discussions at European level. And so I was wondering if on the topic of nationalism versus federalism, if you as a youth organization, if you have a position, or if this is something which is not the core of what you think about.
I think as an organization, we stand for European integration, and that's a core part of also the sort of message and the values and the historical mission and purpose that the European Youth Forum has had. Also in terms of the fact that, as I was mentioning, so we've been around since the 60s and the 70s, the 80s, which were obviously very turbulent times for our continent, and we saw even then different ways of young people being organized in different types of youth organizations, whether it was again national or international youth organizations, which used to be separate organizations before they merged. A bit of youth forum trivia.
Always good.
But actually there's the history of our continent is shaped side by side with history of youth organizations, because wherever you look, we see that the European project has been built together with young people. There is this one photo that I saw at some point from our historical archives. There was this campaign, I think maybe in the 70s or 80s, was the young people of Europe simply a generation ahead. The young people who were asking for this building and strengthening of this European community and identity. And it's what we stand for today as well. Obviously, we have member organizations and our youth organizations with very established history, like the Young European Federalists, for example, who have very concrete proposals and positions on European federalism and on what such a system should look like. From the side of the youth forum, sort of our position is always that being together and we are stronger together as a community, as young Europeans or young people in Europe, and at the end of the day, I think we saw maybe the lack of unity and what it can do to us across the board in the past few weeks and months. And I think we're in a point where our differences are so, when you put it in perspective, they're so insignificant that it seems almost silly to obviously respecting cultural differences and everything and maintaining that component. But it feels almost silly to sacrifice this ideal of European cooperation, which I think, for the sort of founding parents of the European Union throughout all of its stages, was almost outlandish to imagine, the degree of cooperation and coordination and integration that we've achieved today. So it seems natural to only keep moving forward. And I think that's always what young people have brought and have to bring at all levels, whether it's in politics, in activism, in working in different organizations or institutions. That's part of our role, and we need to embrace it.
Yeah, and here indeed, if we look at the last numbers of the Eurobarometer, also in this case, the young people are the one that are the most Europeans, above the average population. So I also do feel that there is this push from young generation in having more unity at the European level. And do you feel this, you represent young people, but do you feel a mismatch with the older generation? Because I personally do feel it sometimes that young people are more prone to create a more federalist Europe than the older generations. And why?
I think I'm not sure if one is more prone to this idea or than the other, and this really comes back always for me to the fact that we don't really understand what it means to have United Europe or United States of Europe or however you want to call it, and what that would look like ideally for each of us or for young people or for the older generation. And that's where maybe the difficulty in identifying agreements can come sometimes, right? Or that it would be easier to spot disagreements. But ultimately, I think, again, and I would bring it back to what I was saying in the beginning, young people are not a homogeneous group. And I think it would be difficult and potentially dangerous to treat them as such. We saw it at the European Parliament elections and at the recent national elections that happened, for example, in Germany, in Italy, and so on, where everyone said, okay, the young people are responsible for the rise of the far right, and that's why Europe is going to the right. And when you actually break down the data sets, you see that the increase in for example, far right voting tendencies or trends is not statistically significant over the average population. But there is this tendency sometimes to see young people as disruptors only in a negative way, right? And I think that's where this divide comes from. But ultimately, for all of us, I think the purpose is not to change our way of living or to change the way in which our continent or our countries in some cases work for the purpose of leaving someone behind, but rather because they're no longer fit for a purpose for the world that we live in today. And there's different ways of going about it, from a federalist movement to having different, competencies or initiatives at the European level. But ultimately, the goal, I think, is there. This idea of cooperation and dialogue is what underpins all of it.
Is there a lot of cooperation ongoing between you and other youth groups? You mentioned the Young European Federalists, but could also be others.
Yeah, so they are our member organizations. The Young European Federalists, they're an international youth organization with a very long history on our continent. And obviously we work with our member organizations and with other youth organizations and youth movements to support each other, and also to be able to tackle and work on and support different political priorities that maybe the youth forum isn't working on directly, let's say. And for us, that's precisely the value of having this European youth movement and this the European Youth Forum, is that when you speak to one platform, you actually have access to a whole network and a whole basically tapestry of youth organizations that really work and are present in so many different fields. And here again, I'm mentioning, for example, young people from rural areas, or young farmers, or young people in sports, or young entrepreneurs. So it's really it's this one voice approach that we have, and that has really brought us so far up until this point.
And I think that the beautiful part is you also see that many perspective on lives, no, by young people. Indeed, you mentioned young farmer, young entrepreneur, and I guess it's difficult, like, for yourself to put in the mindset of representing all such different realities, no? Like, how did you deal with this?
It's true. It can be difficult, but what our principle always is that we, as the Youth Forum, for example, we want to make sure that the young people who are the closest to the topic in a certain case or on a certain issue, they are the ones who sit around the table and they share their experience, or they bring their voices forward, or they share their lived experiences in some cases. So for us, it's always the point of also creating spaces where representatives of young people from different countries, if it's a national issue, or from different fields, if it's a topic or a policy specific, topic-specific policy discussion, they have the space to bring those perspectives and their expertise, because that's also a thing, right, where young people are always brought in to be asked what's wrong, you know, like what are you unhappy about, when in fact, for example, we had this initiative with the EU Youth Test, or the EU Youth Check, which is something that we came up with as a proposal during the European Year of Youth in 2022, which is a proposal for an impact assessment tool for all EU policies, to have at every stage of the policy-making process. So before the policy is created, while the policy is being written, during before it's approved, to see if it has any negative impacts on young people in the long term, and then for young people in youth organizations to be involved in the implementation and monitoring of that policy. So really a fully like policy lifecycle approach, to have the perspectives of young people mainstreamed throughout the whole policy-making process. And the point there is that we want policymakers to speak with young people who are experts in their fields, which is what most of our member organizations bring when it comes to representing young people from different fields and areas, and to listen to them directly, not only as young people and with a particular lived experience from that perspective, but also with experience and expertise on the topics that they're working on, right? So there's a twofold approach that we always engage with, and we remind institutions that when they speak with young people who, again, it might be a young farmer or a young person who is leading, for example, a youth club, or their local exchange youth exchanges organization. They are speaking to practitioners and experts in those fields.
Yeah, and I think this is also in some member states in particular a misconception on young people, know that if you are young, you cannot be an expert in your field. So, for example, myself coming from Italy, I could see a lot in the job market. Until you are young, 35, they say, no, you don't have experience. And maybe you're a super good expert, like, so also this, I think, is a cool fight to...
Absolutely. And it's an understanding that we try to sort of bring about, that while you might not have the 25 years of experience that what we would usually understand as an expert has, there is a very different perspective. There's a fresh approach. There is a different ways of engaging with that domain or with that profile that practitioners who, again, have these decades of experience might not have or do not have. And naturally, there's not a this or that approach. We never say we should only listen to young people, but historically and traditionally, we have seen young people being excluded from these spaces, which impact all of our lives directly. And at some point, you also have to ask yourself, to which extent are these policies sustainable? If you make policies that have, a short, medium, and long-term effect on the lives of young people, of people who are young today, and also children and adolescents and generations who are not yet born today, and you don't involve them or you don't think about their perspective, how do you make sure that your policies are sustainable? It's impossible.
You said that you started in the youth engagement field already more than 10 years ago.
Yes.
At the time in Romania. Was there a particular moment when you decided now it's time to do this, or how did this happen?
I've sort of always, it's weird to say this and it sounds very corny, I know. It sounds very unbelievable, but I've sort of always had this sense of when I felt like something wasn't right, I always felt the need to speak about it. And sometimes it would be that, I don't know, when I was playing with my friends in the park, and then someone would tell us, "You're not allowed to be here," and I'd go like with my 9-year-old voice, "Yes, we are. It's all right. It's all right to be here. We're allowed to play." And then later on in school, it was in the school students council and like as a class representative and so on. I was always curious and interested in it. And then when I got to the high school level, I ran for elections as the president of the school students council, and there were many things or many topics that were affecting the lives of my colleagues on a daily basis and directly and very, very concretely that no one, maybe in the representation movement by that point, had wanted to tackle, because they involve taking time of your free time, having to go speak with the headmaster, for example, to address these things. And you're like, but what if I, get a bad grade and so on afterwards? And these are all things that I somehow never, I never let them stop me. But there definitely have been throughout the years in the School Students Council in particular, there have been years where many teachers have tried to intimidate me, many policymakers have tried to intimidate me. Oh. I remember at some point during the COVID pandemic, there was a question, I was giving an interview and there was a question about whether or not I was doing my classes online and whether or not they were being carried on online. And the truth is that they weren't done properly, and I said it. I remember then it was a whole thing. I was summoned to the principal's office, and then there was a whole question about whether or not I should be doing this. So there have been attempts to intimidate me, at times even to almost dehumanize me in front of my colleagues just because I was standing up for our rights. I was called at some point by one of the teachers called the individual. I was not addressed to by my name.
Honestly, back in Romania.
Back in Romania, by the individual. And they're all these things are, I mean, honestly,
That's so petty.
It's so petty. It's so petty. And also, I'm now with the mind that I have now to think for a 40-something-year-old professor to do this to a 15-year-old, it's like, get a life, kind of, it's like,
honestly.
Yeah.
But they never, I mean, and that does something to a 15-year-old. And at some point, especially back home and during the COVID pandemic, I used to get death threats when I said that we need to have, and we would do these very large consultations, and young people would tell us, or the students would tell us, we want or we don't want to get vaccinated, we want or we don't want or feel safe going back to school. And we'd make proposals also based on those consultations and based on what we heard from our colleagues. And sometimes these proposals were not popular. For example, we said that school students need to go back to school because the losses, the learning educational losses, were so significant, and I'm feeling very, very sad that unfortunately we were right back then when we said just how significant these learning losses would be. And I would get death threats saying that why the F do I care about this topic? I should go back to studying. At some point, we were speaking also about the sort of parallel, like the private tutoring practices that teachers would have sometimes with students from their own classrooms, and they've done after hours and they pay a lot, and those were never like taxed. And we said if we need more money for education, let's just tax that parallel education system that exists and that is not regulated. And then I received again death threats and messages, and what do I care? And I should mind my own business. And it's really difficult not to give up when you see all of those pushes against you. At that time I found them funny. Now it's a bit sad to think of it.
No, it's quite horrific then.
It is, but then it's sort of really it helps when you have around you also teams and people that know what they're fighting for and why you're fighting for what you're fighting. And I've always been surrounded by really amazing colleagues, amazing people that also made these fights worth it.
And when you look back now over these 10 years that you've been in the, let's call it, in the business, what are the things that really you say this is my main learning from this time, or what are the things you really take away?
I think there are a few. Maybe the first one is that you simply cannot do it all. And when you are in a youth movement, when you are a youth representative, there are people who expect you to speak up about everything and to do everything. And the second you speak about something and you didn't about something else, or you have a position on something and that position isn't exactly what everyone wants, there's always going to be a back and forth. And I think the first understanding is that you cannot do it all. The second one, I mean, on this, you always have, I think, to be very careful and to make sure that you can have the most impact in whatever you do, because we operate in all youth organizations, and especially the ones that are volunteer-led, we operate with very limited resources. People take time off of work, time off of school to dedicate their lives to this. So you have to be very careful about what you advocate for and what you fight for and what actually can have an impact. Because it's very nice to speak about everything, but then ultimately if it's just an Instagram story and then it just disappears after 24 hours, but you put in 5 days in preparing it and then publishing it, then you have to ask yourself, what impact does it truly have? The second thing is that and I'm seeing this and we're seeing this very, very often in the youth sector, that activists or people working, they burn out. On one hand, because the resources that we have at our disposal to deliver on, what is expected of us or what we want to do are very limited, and they're sometimes actually right now they're decreasing. And on the other hand, the fact that you feel the pressure, and everyone that I've met that is volunteering for or works for a youth organization, they do it also because they care, because otherwise you could do literally anything else in the world, right? Where the pressure is less, where the pay is better. So taking care of yourself is really important, because otherwise you just won't be able to do anything else.
Indeed is a huge sacrifice of your free time. I also see from at the time, also in local politics, but also in you dedicate basically a very large chunk of your free time to this. So if you do not have really a core mission within yourself, it's difficult to keep going, no? And also you were mentioning the death threats, but in the end you are still here, no? So I think it's something more that drives you.
It is, and you always have to remind yourself what you're doing it for, and who you're actually doing it for. And for me, it's always been, and I carry that forward from the local to the national to the European levels. It's always been remembering just how powerless and how unheard of I felt, and how unheard I felt in multiple, I don't know, moments in my life, or whenever decisions were made that didn't involve me, and just how demotivating it felt as a young person to not know that there is someone fighting for me, or to not so that's really being that for the young people that in the youth organization that we represent, that I represent, is really what keeps me going at the end of the day. And just knowing that for the short amount of time that you're here, you give it your all, and then you really try your best, and you work with the people around you to make a difference genuinely. But it's not easy, and I don't think anyone comes into the youth movement for the purpose of getting sort of standing ovations or congratulations for what is in some cases a sacrifice. But I think maybe all of us at some point want or are keen to share this with others, right? Just for people to understand that this happens, and there's a lot of work happening there, and that it's up to each of us to also keep this momentum going, right? That we can't do it alone.
We see also like small in brackets impacts are still big impacts, like having an impact on people's life, even if it's not that big as you dream of, it's really something to be proud of. Are you some examples you would like to share?
So for example, when it comes to I don't know, on one hand, when it comes to the impact or the motivation that some people need to get engaged at different levels, I always say you do not need to lead the youth organization, or you don't need to be very visible or very public or very politically engaged to make a difference in your local community. And I think that's what we all need to understand, that it can come just from organizing a community cleanup, for example, or it can come from having a campaign at the local level to invite or encourage more young people to go out and vote for the local elections. So there's many different ways of doing it. For me, definitely some of the sort of biggest achievements, they absolutely come from the students movement. That's also where I spend the biggest amount of time in. I remember back home, back in Romania, in the students movement, we really worked a lot to make sure that we had actually free transportation for school students from remote areas, that we had there's a system of school student allowances in Romania that really was very unequal at the time. Some students got like €5 per month, and then some got 100 or 250. So we managed to land on like a basic minimum amount, and to secure funding for it in the national budget. And that took many years of petitioning and then discussions with policymakers. And I remember at some point just like looking over the budget with the Minister of Education, we're trying to figure out, okay, where does this fit? How can we make it happen? How can we make it work? And then at the European level, there's definitely so much to be proud of when it comes to, for example, I don't know, our internships work, right? We're closer than ever to reaching an agreement, and now they're in the trialogues to reaching an agreement on banning unpaid internships and ensuring fair working conditions for interns. And then obviously at the end of the day, what I'm very proud of is the fact that throughout all of these, the past 6 years since the pandemic, I think have been very tough for the youth sector when it comes to funding cuts, when it comes to disengagement, when it comes to maybe this fatigue of online engagement and so on, that have really hit youth organizations quite hard. That we're still here, we're still standing, we always bounce back, we're always here to bring the voice of our peers into these spaces. And it's just, no matter how hard it gets, when you're driven by something that's bigger than what you're traversing right now, when you're driven by mission and by values, it's very hard to cut that down or to make that disappear completely. There are better and less fortunate moments in any movement, but right now I'm very proud of how strong the youth movement is across the continent and where we are, and also where we're going.
When you will leave your mandate in a couple of months from now, what is it that you will tell your successor? What tips will you give him or her?
Sleep. First of all, make sure that you sleep. Don't be afraid. And one of my predecessors in the school students movement told me this once: I wish for you to feel on your shoulders the weight of all that you represent. Not so much that it paralyzes you, but enough for it to actually push you forward and to remind you every single day why you're there. And this position, and being in the youth movement in general, is a privilege, and it's definitely been, the honor of my life so far to do it. And just to keep going, and that no matter what we do, we never do it alone. We always do it with a team. We always do it with the people we do it for. And it makes a difference. It really does make a difference. Maybe you felt it as well in your lives growing up and different organizations that you were engaged with. But we're here for a reason, and we will be here for a very long time to come. Because there's an impact to what we do.
Yeah, and I would say this is a very inspiring conclusion. So I think we would really like to thank you for the time. It has been a very cool episode. So thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, man.
Thanks for having me, and congrats for the podcast.
Thank you.
Again, another big fan.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thanks a lot.